everyone, my name is Nick Robertson, founder of Rare Combinations LLC, and today I'm going to be telling you the most simple way to use this alcohol percentage detector. The things that you'll need for using the alcohol detector in this temperature calibration way is, of course, the alcohol detector. This one is already warmed up. It's had the 15-minute warm-up period. You'll also need the 0.5% alcohol content standard, which 50 milliliters are provided with the purchase of your alcohol detector. However, it's very easy to make more for yourself if you need it. You'll need some sample tubes, which are, of course, provided with the detector. And you'll need either a hot or a cold water bath in order to change the temperature of your standard as well as your samples. So the idea behind this method is that you're going to find the temperature at which the detector reads 0.5% alcohol content when 0.5% alcohol standard is screwed into the device. So in order to do this, what we'll first do is take some of our 0.5% standard, and we're going to pour about 20 milliliters of this into the tube. So you don't need to be exact with the volume that you pour into these sample tubes with your standard or with your samples, but it is best to be consistent with the volume that you use. Another thing to note is that even though there are graduation lines on these tubes are very cheap, and so they're likely to not be accurate. So if you're trying to measure for a dilution or something along those lines, it's definitely best to use a pipette, an accurate syringe, or a graduated cylinder. So since the detector is warmed up and we have our 0.5% alcohol content standard at room temperature, we're going to unscrew our air tube, set that to the side, and we're going to screw in our 0.5% sample. So if we're really lucky, it will read 0.5% alcohol content on the very first try. However, that's probably not going to be the case. As you can see now, it's probably going to read about 0.6% alcohol content. So the way that we fix this issue is we're either going to heat or cool the sample. So if with the 0.5% alcohol standard it reads higher, like in this case, that means we know that the calibration temperature must be lower than 20 degrees C. But if the standard reads lower than 0.5%, then we know that the calibration temperature must be higher than what's reading on the screen. Okay, so this is our used sample that we just measured. We can no longer use this because as you measure any of the sample, whether the standards or an unknown, it slightly reduces the alcohol content as you measure it. So this sample is done, we can no longer use it. What we're going to do now is immerse our 0.5% standard in a cold water bath. So this is why it's best to have a separate temperature probe on hand. We're going to change this to Celsius and check the temperature of our water bath. It looks like it's about 19 degrees. So on the detector it read 20 degrees C when our sample was screwed in. So that means our water bath probably should be around 15 degrees C so that we can properly cool our standard down to the calibration temperature. So I'm going to get slightly colder water and we'll come back in a minute. Alright, so we're back and we have some slightly cooler water. It's a little less than 16 degrees, closer to 15 degrees C. And you can see we have our 0.5% alcohol standard cooling down in there. And we also have our sample that we're going to test in here as well. Now if you're testing multiple samples, you'll probably want to have an ice bath or have them cooling in the refrigerator down to your calibration temperature while you're calibrating your detector. Alright, so we're going to check in on our 0.5% alcohol standard. It's been cooling in here for a minute. We're going to check what temperature it is now. So this temperature probe is reading about 17.5 degrees C. So we're gonna wait a tiny bit longer. This temperature probe and the temperature probe on the detector may be slightly off. This is a really cheap temperature probe, so they might be slightly different. That's okay. Try to be consistent with which one you're looking at. So remember, we were looking at this one earlier. This said 20 degrees C, so we're gonna use 18. We're gonna try about 18, maybe 17 degrees C on this display and see what reading it gives us. All right, so we're gonna prepare another 0.5% alcohol content sample. Gonna try to use about the same amount of liquid. That will be fine. And leave this cooling in the water bath just in case we need to go a little bit lower on the temperature. We'll check the temperature of this sample with the probe. It's warmed up a little bit since going in this warm tube. It's about 18 degrees C, but we're gonna check it anyway. Okay, so we have our 0.5% standard in here, and we finally found a temperature. It's about 19 degrees C. It's floating around 0.5% alcohol content. So as you're doing this, what you're going to want to do is try out different temperatures around room temperature. Now, your calibration temperature might be as low as about 15 degrees C, or as high as maybe even 30 degrees C. So just, adjust your 0.5% standard accordingly until you get 0.5% alcohol content reading on the screen. So now that we have our calibration temperature, we can take our sample that we have here. So this is just some kombucha that I make at home for personal consumption. I don't brew and sell kombucha anymore. However, this device was made when I was trying to sell kombucha commercially. So anyway, we're gonna take our sample and pour it into a new tube. So this was just washed out. And we're gonna take about the same amount of sample, about 15 or 20 milliliters. Okay, so we're gonna take our sample that we just poured and test it in the detector now. So this is pretty exciting. I actually haven't tested my own kombucha because I don't care too much about what the alcohol content is, just because I'm drinking it for myself, and 1% isn't gonna do any harm for me. So as you can see, the temperature of our sample is 17 degrees C, which is much lower than the calibration temperature that we found, which was 19 degrees C. So you can see me right here just warming up the sample with my hand. Hopefully we can get it up to 19. Now, what you don't want to do is run the sample in the detector for too long, because if you run the sample in the detector for more than about, I would say about 2 minutes, you run the risk of actually reducing the alcohol content of your sample as it's running. Another thing that I'll warn against is you can see there's some bubbles forming. Some kombuchas will form a lot of bubbles, and the bubbles may carry into the detector. You do not want this to happen because it can completely ruin the detector, so watch for that. And it looks like we're at our temperature, 19 degrees C, and it's reading 0.88% alcohol content. Again, with the foaming of the sample, just be very careful. Watch the foam that's rising in the sample as you screw it in, and if there is excessive foam for whatever reason in the kombucha that you're testing, you can add about 1 or 2 milliliters of some sort of neutral oil like vegetable oil, or if you have it, you can add a single drop of anti-foam, and that will completely fix the issue. Okay, so that is the simplest way to use the alcohol detector. What we did was we found the calibration temperature of the device, and then we were able to test our unknown kombucha sample at that calibration temperature. Using the built-in calibration curve in the detector, we were able to read the alcohol percentage straight off the screen and get our reading in about 1 minute. So as you can see, I've made a bit of a mess here, so I'll clean this up. And in future videos, you'll be able to see a slightly more complicated way to use the detector, but a more accurate way that allows you to choose the temperature that the detector is calibrated at. Anyway, thank you so much for watching, and feel free to contact me if you have any questions about how to use the detector, or if you would like to know more information about it. Thank you.